Well, thank you very much, Lloyd, and thank you, John, for a great introduction to a very difficult subject. And surprisingly as though it sounds, you may be thinking that I'm going to defend the Church of England, but actually I agree with absolutely everything that John and Lloyd have said. And I'm going to, I think, set out a few more of the challenges and how we are trying to deal with them. First of all, who I am. I'm Janet Gough, Director of the Cathedral and Church Buildings Division of the Archbishop's Council. And along with John, I'm absolutely delighted about the Wells decision. You've got a copy of the Church Care annual review, and you'll see that we have there, Church Care is our short-term, our name, the name we use is in the Cathedral and Church Buildings Division because it's too long. You'll see that if you look at the back, we have about 14 staff, and we provide the Secretariat for two statutory bodies, the Church Buildings Council and the Cathedral Fabric Commission, both of which I'm Secretary, and I'm very pleased to see Judith Lee, who's a member of the Commission. We were meeting yesterday in the audience. We also have 6 conservation committees, and we draw upon all sorts of experts, all of whom give their time completely voluntarily, both to look after our treasures, but also to award a series of grants to help hard-pressed parishes properly look after their treasures. Because we are, of course, a totally bottom-up church. And the Church of England has, I'm a real numbers person, I'm afraid, approximately 16,000 parish churches, 12,500 of which are listed. So as such, we are probably the biggest single manager of England's built heritage, but we are that unintentionally. And as John pointed out, it's not just the architecture of these wonderful buildings, but it is all the extraordinary works of art and other treasures, as he defined them, that they house. One of our challenges, and it was interesting hearing Crispin say this, is that we don't have a national inventory. I was talking to the chairman of the Victorian Albert Museum, and he asked me for an inventory of our church treasures. We don't have that, unfortunately. Each individual church knows what they have, but I hope that it is something that we will be able to move towards. Because, for instance, next year, as part of a major operation we're undertaking on faculty simplification, we are introducing an online faculty application process, and attached to that will be a national online national church heritage database. And within that, I hope over time, we will be able to not only record all of our treasures, but be able to extract a single list, so have a better idea. It's not going to happen overnight, but things are getting better. So I wanted to start with, one other thing before I move on to this. I completely want to respond to something John said about understanding better what our treasures are. Our newest recruit to the Cathedral and Church Buildings Division is someone who has worked as a volunteer for the Church's Conservation Trust, called Dr. Gabriel Bing, who is responsible for setting up the Church Guides website. So Church Guides very much on our agenda. So if you pick up this copy of the Church Care Guidance Notes on Treasures, and for your benefit, I updated it only yesterday because of the Wootton St Lawrence appeal. I just want to start, or give you where the Church Buildings Council is coming from. Has everyone got a copy of this? So it says that the top paragraph on the first page, and please, I know people don't like 3 columns, maybe we'll move away from 3 columns, but the policy of the Church Buildings Council is that church treasures belong in churches and should only be removed in the most exceptional circumstances. That is for all the reasons that have been given, so I'm not going to dwell on that, but just to give you a couple of examples, and I'm sorry I haven't got beautiful PowerPoint pictures, but the Thornham Harbour Retable, which, if you remember, went through a fantastic conservation programme run by the Hamilton Carr Institute at Cambridge University in 2003, and is now back where it should be, in a tiny Suffolk church, behind a special screen, absolutely appropriate, fully monitored environmental conditions, and the church is open so people can go and visit it. And perhaps one of my favourites, because as John said, we mustn't just look at the really internationally significant objects, but this pair of angels by Grinling Gibbons. Now they are housed in a little church, Burnham-on-Sea, on the Somerset north coast. And a lovely story about how they got there. I hope I'm getting this right, but they, of course, or they came from the chapel in the Palace of Whitehall, which burnt down. And someone who was a canon at Westminster Abbey, also later, I think, became Bishop of Rochester, but also was genuinely a vicar, so had a vicarious holding, namely Burnham-on-Sea in Somerset. Somehow they made their way all the way down to Burnham-on-Sea, but as you can see, 10 years ago, they were not being very well displayed. They were at the back of the West End Tower with tons of other clutter. So over a period of time, the Church Buildings Council, through one of its conservation committees, was able to work with the parish, and they are now, they've been brought forward into the nave. They're on beautiful, specially commissioned pedestals. We're in the Society of Antiquaries, so I can say that we made sure that the right archaeological research was undertaken because of the extra weight going on at the back of the nave. A couple of pews, I think, were removed, but they really do look very much better, and there's much better interpretation. And it's stories like that that we would like to see. I was also delighted, the Church Buildings Council ran an international conservation symposium 2 years ago at Westminster Abbey, to hear that internationally it's the same trend. So we heard from some colleagues from Norway, for instance, that there is a movement to put objects back from museums into church buildings. And at that same symposium, the person responsible for the conservation of the Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece was there. And of course, the Ghent altarpiece is being conserved in situ. And at that conference, we could also take people round to the Westminster Abbey coronation chair, which at that time was again being conserved in that little chapel at the west end of Westminster Abbey. And I was delighted to hear at another conference that Crispin spoke at, that we arranged last month, would always welcome, Bernard Donahue, the leading Visitor Attractions Association, saying that the dwell time, his word not mine, at where the coronation chair was being conserved was much greater than, for instance, the Cosmati pavement or whatever. So it's something that the general public are really interested in, conservation of objects, and if we can conserve them in situ, how wonderful. So that's the best of all possible worlds, but as Lloyd said, let's look at the less good things. Under the faculty rules, I've just lost my... Any disposal is required to be referred to the Church Buildings Council before a faculty may be granted. And the Church Buildings Council got rather concerned that we seem to be getting more and more applications for disposals of church plate and a whole range of church treasures. And we felt that there was a real need for some guidance. So 2 years ago, in 2012, we pulled together this piece of guidance. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but just also to explain what has happened since then. In addition to offering guidance, I suppose the back end is that we need to take action where things go wrong. We are the sort of the backstop, really, the Church Buildings Council. And we're in a very difficult position. In the first instance, like so many of the amenity societies and other bodies, we just don't have very much money to go to court. And we also have an extra problem in that we can't be seen to be fighting against hard-pressed parishes. We can't be seen to be the rich centre that's rather divorced from the reality of what these parishes are pressing. So we've got this sort of very difficult fine line to tread. However, we felt that a couple of cases that came up were absolutely unacceptable, and unless something was done about them, the situation was just going to get worse. The other thing that we felt was that there was a complete lack of consistency across the country. As far as church buildings are concerned, a faculty is granted within each diocese. We have 42 dioceses with 42 different chancellors. And I know I've got one sitting in the second row, so I'm sure he's going to say that's not the case. But they do make different rulings. However, there is an overall, an overarching senior court called the Court of the Archers, which sits in St Mary le Bow. We saw that wonderful weather vane, thank you, John. And that rulings coming from that court must be taken into consideration by chancellors. However, for instance, specifically in Lloyd's St Stephen Walbrook appeal, and we became party opponents in that, the Chancellor said, I do not need to refer to this is just guidance by the Church Buildings Council. So it's absolutely marvellous now to have a new appeal and a decision made by the Court of the Archers. So I'll try and explain how we got there. So there were these two cases. Let's deal very briefly because Lloyd has already mentioned St Stephen Walbrook. What he didn't say is, of course, it is one of Pevsner's top 10 all-time buildings in England. And we were very worried about this case because so often the reason given for selling a treasure is financial need. And we felt that if a church in the City of London, one of the richest places in the country, were to sell its treasure, that would open the floodgates. And it seemed as though nobody else was going to stop this. Now, there's a very messy history, as Lloyd said, because, of course, the painting got taken out sometime in the late 70s to 1986 without a faculty, and something should have been done about it then. But just because it wasn't done about it then, we felt we had to do something now when they then came to sell them. So the Church Buildings Council, along with the Georgian Group, but actually nobody else, so not English Heritage, no one else, acted as party opponents. And as Lloyd said, we quoted these extraordinary bits from the consistory court judgment. And I'm going to quote John, I assume this was John, but I love the Country Life editorial of July 2013, which described that judgment as justification by nonsense. Anyway, we did appeal, but I had to go to my governing body, the Archbishop's Council, to actually get permission to appeal and also the money to do so. And sadly, although we got our appeal request was accepted by the Court of the Archers, we couldn't proceed because we didn't have the money. What would have happened is, although we had a wonderful Chancellor acting pro bono for us, if we had lost, we would have had to pay the other side's costs, and they had a QC because they had all this money coming in from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and we couldn't have afforded that. We tried to go down the route. We followed, in some secular courts, there's something called a protective costs order, but the Court of the Archers wouldn't accept that. However, we did appeal in the Wootton St Lawrence case because the costs were less great. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of that. Wootton St Lawrence, and again, I'm very sorry that I don't have a better picture. Here it is. This is this wonderful 16th century armet or helmet that sat above the funerary monument. It was Sir Thomas Cook. John, you're better at this time. Anyway, various other items around the funerary monument had been stolen, so it was removed from the church or from display in the late 60s, and then was lent to the Royal Armouries in 1975, which is where it has been ever since. But somebody decided that a lot of money could be got from this thing, and so in 2010, the parish applied for the faculty to sell the object. And sure enough, in December 2010, this is the first time we found out about it, it got sold and purchased by an overseas buyer for £45,000. Now, this is the wrong way round, but we heard about it and we immediately did something about it. And we said that the sale should be rescinded and the faculty should be overturned because the proper process wasn't followed. And there were two issues here. One was they had not, if you look at this guidance, under the new faculty jurisdiction rules, Rule 8.6, every single disposal has to be referred first to the Church Buildings Council, and they haven't done it. So that was the first procedural issue. The second thing was that we didn't think the parish had the right to sell the church, and that's because we understood there were heirs at law who had responsibility for the monument, and they actually did manage to track down the two heirs at law. Anyway, as a result, the Chancellor agreed to overturn the faculty, and a long time passed, he got ill, various other things, and then in the summer he did a written faculty, so we didn't have a consistory court in which we could present our side of the the story. And to our huge disappointment, he re-granted permission for the, he granted the faculty. So that's when we did appeal. And again, the Court of the Archers accepted our appeal. And finally, on the 26th of February, we sat there, sat in St Mary le Bow for the appeal case. 3 wonderful senior ecclesiastical judges. We got the judgment just before Easter, and I want to run through the main points. And here it is, if anybody wants to have a look at this. You can also download it, it's quite big, but you can download it or look at it online. We've got it on the Church Care website. So, the main points. The first is a strong presumption against sale. The second point is little weight to separation. Now, one of the things we were really nervous about was that this thing had been sitting in the Royal Armouries for a long time. It wasn't the greatest case to take us the appeal to get good guidelines to cover everything, but they were very clear, the judges, that little weight should be given to separation. Perhaps I should go back to the first point. The court held that rather than engage in the semantics of whether petitions had established a special reason, chancellors only need to decide whether the grounds for sale are sufficiently compelling to outweigh the strong presumption against sale. So that's the determining principle. Various other things. It's not a good enough reason to dispose of something because of the cost of insurance, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Another very interesting thing, and I know that somebody in the audience wants to raise the Laycock Cup, and I will be very happy to respond to that. But they established that where sale absolutely has to take place, there should be what they described as a sequential approach when the disposal of church treasures was contemplated. It says here, the Chancellor should consider first disposal by loan, and only when that was inapposite, disposal by sale to a museum or gallery, and only where such limited sale was inapposite should disposal by sale on the open market be considered. And here, the interests of public visibility should normally prevail when the court was considering proposed disposal by sale of articles of local or national distinction. So that's really helpful. Another thing that was very helpful is that they said there should be no distinction for articles used in connection with, between articles used in connection with worship and secular objects. Now, obviously, this armament is a secular object, so that is very, very helpful. And then finally, they made much better ruling about financial emergency as opposed to financial need. Interestingly, both of these cases, both St Stephen Walbrook, who've recently done a relighting scheme, and we know had quite a lot of money, and we also know, frankly, if they wanted to conserve the painting, we're quite convinced the Heritage Lottery Fund would have provided the funds to conserve it in situ. So no argument for financial emergency there. Similarly, we had a look at the accounts of Wootton St Lawrence, and I'm absolutely delighted to say it's a thriving church, absolutely getting on with a very active ministry. So again, no serious financial issues there. Okay, well, shall we have a very quick look at this? Because this is written not for people like you, this is written for hard-pressed parishes, and I think that's what we must always remember. So we start out saying why we think, this very important point about that treasure should always be conserved within churches. The second thing is a theological underpinning of the policy, and it was the Archbishop of Rome, Williams, was Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, and he gave us some very useful words here. Number two here, ownership, and I think this is very important. We seem to be getting a whole pile of applications because people felt that they needed to act like charitable trustees and realise or maximise the value of the assets they held. That is absolutely not the case. These are historic assets. They are held for the enjoyment of our and future generations. We are just custodians. It says under here, number two, church treasures are not an asset of PCC. All movable goods of the church belong to the parishioners at large, with the church wardens acting as custodians on their behalf. And again, the Wootton judgment, appeal judgment, upheld that. But they're not ordinary assets. We talked about financial emergencies, so I'm not going to mention that again. Insurance. Now, here, very strongly, what we advise parishes is not to insure for the market value, but at replacement cost, and that absolutely should not be a reason for disposing of an item. Security. Now, security is a big issue, and I'm not going to say it isn't, and I'm very pleased to see have in the audience. Do you want to stand up and say, just very briefly introduce yourself? Yes.
Mark Harrison, I'm the Policing and Crime Advisor from the show.
Heritage crime, now that haven't sorted out method theft, but heritage crime is, I think, our next challenge, and I'm hoping that with the Church's Conservation Trust and English Heritage that we're going to actually pull together some better policies on conserving these items if we want, as John says, to keep our churches open as much as possible. There are lots of issues. There's going to be issues about this national database as well. People are going to know where things are, but that doesn't mean to say we can't deal with them. Number 8, relationship with auction houses. This is a real issue. Auction houses, I worked for Sotheby's for 10 years, so I know all about this, tend to give very nice, encouraging estimates. That doesn't mean to say you're necessarily going to achieve those estimates. And it's a very dangerous thing. Silver is often only worth the meltdown value of the silver. And church plate is so much more important to keep these wonderful. I was in a tiny church in West Sussex the other day. A pre-Reformation pattern and chalice just kept in the safe in the vestry and used every Sunday, which is absolutely fantastic. I think I probably said enough, but you see the topics. Historic link with the church, great if there is, but also things are constantly being added to churches. Secular origins, again, it's great in the Wootton case that doesn't, just because it's secular rather than for worship purposes, that shouldn't be a reason for selling. Redundancy, we'll use the example here of 2 chests from St Ebbs in Oxford. And just also to let parishes know that there is help out there. So we have grants. Other people, Heritage Lottery Fund is the main source of grants. And that really was all I wanted to say. So we now have much more robust advice, not only in this, but as I said, chancellors have to take account of the Court of the Arches ruling, so we're absolutely delighted about that. I've talked briefly about trying to set up a working party to improve security issues. I've mentioned this Church Heritage National Database. I think that would be really helpful to know exactly what we've got. And I just want to end on a little sort of rather nice note for Wootton St Lawrence, but perhaps not so much Wootton St Lawrence, but all the other churches who have made loans to the Royal Armouries and other national museums. We've persuaded the Royal Armouries to host a party at the Tower of London for these parishioners, just to recognise what an important thing they're doing by conserving this fantastic heritage for all of our benefit.